Hi everyone, welcome to episode 7 of the Startup Playbook Hustle, a new segment of the podcast where I interview some of the best up-and-coming startups and founders on their journey, lessons, and challenges to date. Before we get into this episode, there are a few quick announcements from me. Firstly, I'm bringing down the B2B SaaS Accelerator program Accelerprice to Australia later this year, where we will be investing $75,000 into startups and taking them through a 4-month program which includes 1 month in the US. Accelerprice Australia will provide the cohort with access to investors, key introductions to chief executives and decision makers inside B2B and enterprise organizations, as well as access to some of the best enterprise SaaS mentors in the country. If you're running a B2B or enterprise-focused SaaS product, shoot me an email at rohit@startupplaybook.co. And my second bit of news is that, as some of you may know, I used to run a crowdfunding for fashion platform that helped launch 150 plus brands globally, and I now work with a range of startups and businesses on growth through Playbook Media. I've compiled over 100 growth strategies, tips and hacks, and 50 case studies in a book called The E-Commerce Playbook. It's getting published in April, but you can sign up now for the pre-release and a sneak peek into the content for the book. I'll add a link to the sign-up page in the show notes for this episode at startupplaybook.co. So, coming back to the hustle, my guest for today's episode is Alan Crabbe. Alan has been at the forefront of crowdfunding in Australia, initially as the co-founder of Pozible, one of Australia's premier crowdfunding platforms. He has now launched a new platform, Birchal, which helps businesses facilitate fundraising through equity crowdfunding. In this episode, we talk about deciding on the right business model for your business, how to run a successful crowdfunding campaign, the pros and cons of focusing on niche segments, building champions for your product, and the difference between reward-based and equity crowdfunding. Without further ado, here is my interview with Alan Crabbe. Hi Alan, welcome to the Startup Playbook Hustle, and thanks so much for being on the show today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, yeah. I'm a fan of your work.
Likewise. So for anyone listening at home that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
So pretty much, I suppose if you go back to the very early stages, the story is, I suppose, with Pozible kicking off, I suppose, crowdfunding in Australia back in pretty much late 2009, actually. Pretty much before even crowdfunding became even a concept or a model, actually. So back then, I was actually running a platform at the stage for artists to pre-sell or even sell artwork to their fans or to any customers potentially that might be interested in purchasing it online. And that was, I suppose, our first experience in running a platform as a service. And it sort of gave us a bit of insight into, I suppose, the creative industries at that point in time. And I suppose we did spot this model being used in different industries, which is now crowdfunding. And we looked at leveraging, I suppose, what we've seen in the music industry for the visual artists that we had. We had probably about 300 visual artists actually showcasing artwork at the time. And that sort of left us with an option to keep struggling with this platform with visual artists that weren't selling much, or to, I suppose, what they call pivoting to what has now become crowdfunding. So we were actually one of the first crowdfunding platforms globally to actually provide it as a service to creative people. And the goal initially was just to provide it to artists as a way to better engage, I suppose, their fans or their following into potentially even putting together an experience, an event, or something to better involve people. So that's pretty much how we get started, actually. And since then, pretty much Pozible has become, I suppose, would you say synonymous brand for crowdfunding in Australia since then.
Fantastic. Obviously going back, my background was in a crowdfunding for fashion platform as well. And I remember, back then people, especially in the creative space, were very, very unfamiliar with what crowdfunding as a concept was. It was still very new. Kickstarter wasn't here. How did you sort of find that challenge? And for anyone that's kind of listening at home that's maybe similarly on kind of the cutting edge of things that maybe aren't as mainstream or aren't as well understood in the market, what was your approach with Pozible?
Do you know, it's it's pretty interesting. Like, I think you often hear from founders too that they talk about that very slow process of getting traction. And for us, like Pozible, I suppose if I'm serious about the way that we approached Pozible back then, it was really just a side project. It was this project that we loved doing. We kept our skills alive, and we hoped it would make some extra revenue, maybe even pay the rent. I think that was the original goal. And we sort of, I suppose we looked at it as we didn't know how big this could be. We thought that we could help like creative people and the space that they're in, and they could leverage, I suppose, this as a tool, because it served the purpose of providing people a payment service. And even back then, back in 2009, 2010, it wasn't as easy to get a merchant facility. Like Stripe didn't exist. PayPal was pretty prohibitive, with its use, and people actually really hated it a lot. So even back then, it was more of this is a really cool service to use to accept payments from large numbers of people, and the time element to it actually made it more compelling. And a lot of people don't know this, but group buying and crowdfunding kicked off at the same year, actually. And obviously you can read the stories of group buying, but I actually remember crossing over a bridge to Ultimo in the early days, and we had already started working on Pozible, and we realized that group buying was becoming very popular. And I remember the conversation I had with my co-founder, Rick, and we said, is this something we should be doing instead of crowdfunding? And we actually made a decision that day across that bridge that we would do what would become crowdfunding. And because we've seen it as a more sustainable and a more friendlier approach for creative people to actually access a new tool that they could use for, I suppose, engaging fans, engaging hopefully new customers.
Yeah, I'm really keen to kind of dive in a little bit deeper to that, because obviously, every year there's a new trend and something that everyone seems to jump on, and you sort of consciously made the decision not to follow that. I guess if you can, kind of diving a little bit deeper into, you mentioned that it was a more sustainable business model. Can you share why you believe that to be the case, and also what were some of the considerations that you had around, all of these people are jumping on the group buying bandwagon, but we really believe in crowdfunding as a platform?
It's a funny one. It's I suppose at that point, because we were at a pivotal point where we could have sort of decided what way to go. We did a lot of research, we did a lot of analysis, and we actually talked to a lot of people that had used group buying, even the first people. And you could see that the model was a bit one-sided in terms of as a platform. So like the small businesses that were accessing it was great to one extent, but it was actually troublesome, and in some ways it could have been detrimental to the business success. So, and I suppose at that point we were very much in the creative industries, and we couldn't see that model actually working for them. So we actually, I suppose, made a conscious decision. Okay, this is a model that I think can grow and actually move into much more, can go into like much more industries, and even potentially go into the small business sector as well. But in hindsight, maybe we should have actually did a group buying and exited it quickly. But again, knowing my experience back then, I probably didn't even know what was happening. Like even the first 2 years of Pozible, we had something really great, and I just didn't know it, if that makes sense. And I think maybe my eyes are a bit more open to actually seeing the potential of new opportunities. So
yeah, that's a really interesting bit of insight. I think everyone. I know that I kind of fall prey to this all the time as well. Like, you're kind of chasing the next milestone or comparing yourself to things that are, just different things that are kind of happening. But often you're overlooking a lot of the, as you said, the strengths of what it is that you're doing and the achievements that you're making along the way. And so I guess you mentioned that in the first 2 years you weren't really sure that you'd found something that was working, that was growing quickly. What was that? Was there a turning point for you that realization kind of dropped?
you know, it's unusual to say, but when you're in a growth phase and it's sustainable growth and it keeps on going, like you just build everything around that growth. So you're constantly better resourcing, you're hiring, you're doing everything to keep that growth going, and you think it's going to keep on going forever. And I suppose it may have been, to be quite honest, actually, and I sometimes tell this to quite a lot of startups that are starting at the moment. On the first day, we knew that we had something quite good, because we actually went out to the market to ask people to use our platform. And of course, we got four people to start with. But on our first day, this campaign came from nowhere. This lady from Brisbane wanted to even just book a flight. She wanted to raise enough to book a flight from Brisbane to Melbourne. And we didn't know this girl. She came onto the platform, set up her own campaign, launched her campaign, and was successful on the first day. And at the end of the day, like I remember having the conversation, it's like, what the hell? Like this was a campaign that was like I think she had sold to more customers on that first day than we had sold for 6 months through the art platform. So in hindsight, it's easy to say that, okay, it was day one. We knew that we had something good. But I think probably at the point of Rick, us, I suppose, investing into putting one of us full time on the business, I think that was the point we realized we had something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, it's really interesting that you touch on that. I think when you hit on something that really solves a problem and that is working, regardless, like it often isn't perfect. It isn't, the structures for growth and like everything aren't there, but it just works and it just grows really quickly, and it's really hard to describe it. You can like feel it and taste it. But I guess on the flip side, like you were talking about your visual arts project, I feel like that was a lot of my experience with Stage Label, where it was over 3 years, it just felt like it was just pushing something uphill. And it's often hard, like I feel like it's often harder to know when something isn't working, because you don't know the point between I just need to persevere a bit longer because it'll eventually work out, to, okay, this actually really isn't going anywhere and we need to pivot. Again, what like, was there a particular moment or something that kind of helped you make that realization with the first project that you started off with?
It was probably a few things. I think it built up. Like I remember also the second conversation, the big conversation we had when we were still running the art platform. Because I think I had been doing a bit more of the sort of support and operation stuff, and I had the conversation with Rick, and I said, "This is not quite working nicely. Is there anything that we can do to actually help these people? Because all we're really doing is helping them list their artwork, which is providing them no extra service than what you would do in the traditional world." So. And I remember it was a conversation that was pretty heated, I think, even back then, where I said, I want to do this other thing, and Rick says, no, we have to. I think we should work a bit harder on this. We haven't give too much time on it. Like we spent quite a lot of time developing it, to be quite honest. I was a developer on it, and Rick was a designer, and okay, we probably took a bit too long actually in the development and the development phase of it, but we had a product and it was operating for a few months, but we weren't doing much like in terms of trade. And I suggested this new concept that I'd seen in the music industry. Like I followed quite a few publications, even in Europe, because I'm originally from the UK. And there's one publication that I always followed was Springwise, and they had all of this network right across the whole world, actually spotting ideas. And I love that concept as well. Like I think I even tried to join that network, but they didn't let me. But I spotted somebody had posted a story about a platform in Europe, in Amsterdam, for musicians, and I loved this concept, and it looked as if it had got traction, even for the musicians at the back then. So I thought, okay, maybe we could do something in Australia, but Rick was a bit hesitant because we had spent so much time, and we didn't want to give up on all of that time. So we came into a compromise that we could run both projects at the same time, and then if this one starts to get traction, we can work more on it. So that was pretty much the decision. So we started the new platform. It wasn't actually called Pozible to start with. It was called Funbreak for the first 6 months until we tried to register the name Funbreak. Not many people know this. There's probably only about 2,000 people in Australia that knows this, but we had to change the name quite fast, and we changed it to Pozible, and yeah, that's pretty much the story.
I guess going back to, and I know like we've jammed separately about sort of working with creatives generally and like the pros and cons of it, but I guess like even just talking to you about your sort of experience with the, starting that initial project focusing on visual design and also just thinking about what is the type of platform that creatives specifically would want. At that time, there was no Kickstarter in Australia. To my understanding, there was no real kind of general crowdfunding platform as well. Was there a temptation to be more broad and just open a crowdfunding platform for everyone versus doing one specifically for creatives? And I guess what kind of made you want to focus in the creative space?
I suppose it was even back at the early days, we were both working full time in other roles, and we wanted something fun and nice, a nice industry to operate in. And the creative industry is, I think it's just a cool industry to be in, and that was really the driver, I suppose, of starting out in the creative industries. But also, I think, even back then, I think we realized the music industry, like Apple, is very much was talked about even back 10 years ago, as being a music tech company, and that's pretty much where Apple has grown its massive business from. So I always looked at the music industry as being, I suppose, the early adopters of new technology and even new business models. So, and even today, I still look to the music. I've even have my team well versed in. Can everyone please just check and see what's going on and new things that are coming in the music industry, like streaming kicked off what's now become subscription-based crowdfunding. I could clearly see that, but I wasn't quick enough to pick that up as a service that Pozible could do. I'm going into all of the things that I've done wrong, but I think if you look at certain industries, they do operate at different speeds to other industries, and the creative industries, for me, are quick to adopt different ideas.
So, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier. One of the things that I loved about crowdfunding when we were doing it with Stage Label was just the huge amount of consumer psychology and different things that you could put to it in different ways. So at Stage Label, one of the big things for us was selling creatives online, especially no-name brands that no one really knew, is really, really tough. And so what we had to think about was how do we incentivize that? And so we had a wait list for people, and then once things launched, we gave discounts to the first few people that ordered to create that social proof before it opened up publicly, and all of those sort of things. Crowdfunding, there are some really, general, well-known, suggestions on how to run a successful crowdfunding platform, or campaign rather. From your experience, what were some of the commonalities, or what are some of the things that, for anyone who's looking to run their own crowdfunding platform, what should they think about, consider, both before, during, and after the campaign?
So this is something that's changed quite a bit, I say, since 2010 to now, the 8 years. Looking back, I don't think anything specifically has changed dramatically. Even from day one, the best campaigns had a short video. They got across the message. They were able to demonstrate who the people were behind the campaign, and be succinct about what they actually wanted to do as a project, and be quite detailed about this is the objectives, this is what we're planning to do, this is what you get in return. Jump in, So that pitch hasn't really changed. It's the distribution of that message has changed, and it's changed quite dramatically, actually. In the early days, when I originally pitched the idea of crowdfunding, at the very start, it was, YouTube is growing exponentially. Facebook is growing exponentially. All of these different channels payment innovation. Everything is growing exponentially at that point in time. And the networks and getting access to, for example, Facebook, Twitter, all of these networks actually were coming of age. They had what would you say, the network, they had network effects. So that they could facilitate these kind of campaigns. If we had launched our platform maybe in 2007, 2008, we would have struggled actually as a platform to actually make a difference for each of these campaigns. So, Facebook, social media, all of these channels were all instrumental in the early days, and you could get access to them. It was great. Everybody was successful. It was perfect, especially for like some musicians, filmmakers, and etc. So, the key thing that has changed since then is getting access to networks. It now has become a lot more expensive, actually, to access the same people that you could have accessed for free back then. So people are having to be a bit more creative in the way that they pitch themselves. So it's been great to see video, especially through social media, get so much traction recently, but again, it's still only going to a small percentage of the network that you've actually created. So people are having to be a bit more creative in the way that they pitch themselves, especially through video, and also picking the right social channels to get access to audiences, particularly audiences that are outside of their own networks. So that's, I suppose, a bit of insight into where it came from, and I suppose the approach that people take these days. It hasn't really changed. It's super succinct messaging, and using social media and multimedia as best you can.
Absolutely. And as you touched on, it isn't just, we have just set up a Facebook page and suddenly we'll get a load of traffic. It's, putting the right sort of strategy and framework and having a think, as you mentioned, about what are the right channels for your audience, what's the type of content you need to put in there. And also, it still surprises me to this day how many people launch things like Kickstarter campaigns or their startup and just haven't thought about the marketing and the growth aspect at all. Again, I think things are changing slowly, which is great, but the more that startups can equally think about how do you actually get this in front of the right people, whether it's a crowdfunding campaign or a product launch or whatever it is, I think the more chances of success that they're giving themselves.
Yeah, well, that's probably the biggest advice that we give through our workshops that we run each month is if you have a well-structured and a well-planned campaign, it's only a matter of just keeping it running whilst you're in campaign mode, if that makes sense. So if you have the content and you have the messaging and you have all of the pitch in place and you know exactly the distribution channels that you're using, is pretty much turn it on and let it run.
Yeah. And
it should, if you've planned things well, it should be successful, and it should be quite a reasonable and easier approach. Most people generally go into crowdfunding and they haven't well planned, especially the launch, and they get to that middle part where it is, I say, hard to create hype. It feels like there's nothing happening, and it's really easy to just give up. If that makes sense. So planning is critical, and I suppose this is what we've learned and what we're taking into what has now become equity crowdfunding as well in Australia. So we're taking that learnings and also the approach that people are taking with reward-based and trying to adapt this for what will become, I suppose, the new regime for crowdfunding in Australia.
Absolutely. So your new gig is a new startup called Birchal. Do you want to talk a little bit about that to the people listening at home?
Yeah. So Birchal is pretty much a spin-out, actually, from Pozible. I think I suppose I changed our approach, I suppose, a year ago to how I suppose we see Pozible growing, and especially growing into different models of crowdfunding. We started with reward-based, and now we see probably 4 key models of crowdfunding. You've got donation-based, reward-based being Pozible. You get loan-based, and what's now become legal in Australia is equity-based crowdfunding. So Birchal is pretty much a financial service platform that's regulated with ASIC to provide equity crowdfunding as a service to companies in Australia.
So for people that may not be as familiar with what equity crowdfunding is, can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so equity crowdfunding allows companies to pitch the same way as reward-based, but instead of providing like perks or rewards or items and experiences, they're providing a way for people to invest in shares in the business. So they will take a small holding in that company.
Yeah. And so I guess what are some of the differences in approaches or things that people have to consider differently to equity crowdfunding than they would to traditional crowdfunding?
I suppose the one thing that I suppose that's pretty critical is that with investments, you're providing people a guide on, I suppose, the future expectations of the company. So people are more investing into, I suppose, the viability or the long-term commercial ability of the business. Is a platform, Birchal is actually more of a hybrid equity and reward-based platform, but first comes investment. So people are investing their hard-earned cash into a business they hope will be successful. So I think with your pitch, just be a bit more, I suppose, careful with how you demonstrate what you hope to achieve with the business. So what's the outcomes and potentially even what's the exit for investors. So do you see in the future someone coming to purchase the company, or do you see your company going public in the future and list on the SX, for example?
Sure. So I guess traditional crowdfunding, reward-based crowdfunding, has been, I guess, skewed towards people launching new products or services. So it's been very much at like the genesis of, we've got this great idea for a hardware product or for something. I guess from a creative aspect, it's a different kind of level of experience as well. But is that, from an equity crowdfunding perspective, are you looking for more sort of mature businesses that have some demonstrable sort of track record that you can point to in terms of like financial outcomes, especially when people are looking to invest their money not into rewards but into actually shares in a company?
Not necessarily. I think I see this as a huge potential, even to just get a business off the ground, actually. So, I've had many conversations just in the last few days. We only became licensed just on the 11th of January this year. So, the conversations I have, the first thing that the companies tell me, what do you want to see? Do you want to see the pitch deck? Do you want to see my financials? What do you want to see to actually list my company on your platform? And generally, the approach that I take generally is, okay, how can equity crowdfunding help your business? In terms of engaging potentially your customer base, and how can equity crowdfunding actually further accelerate the growth of your company, rather than think too much about the money itself first. And generally, from that approach, you can actually know if the company should be considering it as an approach to raising capital first. I reckon, especially more product-based, reward-based crowdfunding, like new technology products, maybe new ideas, in a sense that that need quite, I suppose, much more intense capital requirements to get things off the ground. I see this as quite a disruptive model to, I suppose, better incentivize people to jump in early for a new product. In a sense, companies could be, they could be pre-selling their first product and service, but also incentivizing people to jump in and actually be part of the company from day one. So a really good example of this, and it got a lot of, it was talked about quite a bit when Oculus Rift, for example, they used reward-based crowdfunding, a very early stage actually, and pre-sold the products. And before even people got their hands on the product, Facebook went in, acquired the whole company for $2 billion. I think we all know who benefited from that acquisition. Yet the people that supported it at an early stage, they didn't get the benefit or the value that was created from actually all of these people involved in it. And I think in the future, I think companies should consider that as an approach. And I think this could be a really good marketing approach to thinking about how you launch a business in the future. And also potentially even being a way of validating if you have a customer base to actually access before you actually even look to raise capital or start making something. So.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's often overlooked from a crowdfunding perspective is, as you mentioned, everyone thinks about it usually from a funding aspect, but the value of crowdfunding comes in so many different forms in terms of product validation, in terms of early customers, in terms of a marketing approach as well, and a way to market. And a big thing with equity crowdfunding, I imagine, is that suddenly you've got people that don't just like your product, they own a part of the company, and it becomes part of their company as well, and that gives them a reason to go out and become advocates for it versus just kind of telling them about a cool product that they brought.
Yeah,
really interesting.
I think it's incredibly powerful. Like, this is one case that I probably oversell, but so there's a craft beer company in UK called Brewdog. These guys were one of the first, I think, even globally actually to access equity crowdfunding. And obviously, equity crowdfunding wasn't even a word back in 2009, 2010 when they accessed this. But small craft beer company based in Scotland, a very small town, smaller than where I even come from, in Northern Ireland. But they use this as a way to pretty much build the equipment to set up the first distillery. And they raised, I think, just over £1 million from 1,000 people. Since then, they've went and pretty much done every raise through equity crowdfunding, apart from the last, actually. They're currently in an equity raise, I think the 6th one at the moment, but their last one, they took private equity for the first time. But the existing raise that they're doing at the moment, they're raising $10 million. And the last time I looked, they're up to about 62,000 investors across the UK. For me, that's phenomenal to have that many people out there having a small cut in your business and being champions for your brand and for your products. And I think that has accelerated the growth of that company to where it is today. I think it's one of the largest craft beer companies in the world. It's currently valued at, I think, £1.2 billion. And back 2009, 2010, that small company was valued at 5 million. So I think you can see the power of actually how a crowd of people, especially a tribe of people that are invested into the success of a company, can actually contribute to the growth and to the sustainability even of a business.
How do you see startups or just kind of equity platforms in general working around the valuations of companies, especially if they're sort of early stage companies? Because obviously you've got, your traditional angels and VCs who have done this multiple times and have their own sort of approach and methodology, and I guess a historical track record that they look to when deciding, a valuation of a company at an early stage. How would this sort of work for equity crowdfunding?
You must have obviously been reading through social media channels to see the most asked questions. But yeah, this is probably the most asked question from a company perspective. The answer I tend to give companies is, I think your valuation needs to be trustable and credible. And the best way to have a trust and credible valuation to the business is to either have someone, a third party, actually provide that, I suppose, the details on where that comes from, or having someone invested at that valuation and opening that up for everyone else, if that makes sense. So I think generally like we don't as a platform get involved in this. It really is up to the company to set that valuation. But always remember that you're public facing, and when you're public facing, you'll always find people that want to scrutinize every aspect to the business. I haven't seen a business that doesn't have these people just waiting to pounce whenever you go public with something like this. So I think always have something to answer when someone might question anything around the valuation. So be able to back up where the source of where that came from, whether it's an industry norm or whether someone has invested, has been a lead investor and has set them variables, and maybe even provided some due diligence around the business before, I suppose, opening up to the general public.
Sure. As you mentioned, it's only been very recently that that the government has sort of passed through the regulations, and I think 7 platforms have been given approval, Birchal being one of them. Yep. Again, there's no kind of historical sort of track record or data points for people to do this. But for any startups that are thinking about going down the equity crowdfunding pathway, and looking at it from a perspective of you running Birchal, what are some of the things that that startups should ideally think about, or the stage that they should be at before they look to go public with their equity crowdfunding campaign?
I think the first thing is like, as I mentioned, like, work out if it's actually for them, and is it practical to go public with a raise where the audience that you're trying to target with a raise, and I think about audience as in, like, for a consumer-based company, it's pretty obvious who that audience might be as potential investors. It's probably their customer base or potential customer base, because they understand the product, they understand the brand, they understand how the company operates, the business model. If you're a B2B business, that audience is going to be slightly different. Your customer is going to be maybe outside of the general public, or it could be a large number of, say, tradies, for example, or large numbers of small businesses that might access that service. But the question I would have is, okay, how quickly or how easily can you access that group or that audience of potential investors? Because the big change with equity crowdfunding is that you can go to everyone. You can advertise the fact that you're open to investment. So how do you get access to them, potential investors? Because I don't believe that you should ever rely on platform services and third parties like ourselves. Like we do have audiences, but the people closest to a brand or a company is always going to be much more engaged in the company than anything that we can provide, if that makes sense. So companies need to sell themselves, because generally platforms like ourselves, we can showcase, we can promote, we can do everything from our end, but it's really up to the company to be putting themselves out there and actually know how to get access to their investors, and know the channels to get access to them.
Yeah, it should be an add-on to the strategy, not the core of your strategy when it comes to those things. Alan, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your experience with Pozible, and super excited to see how Birchal kicks off. Part of the Hustle series is to better connect the founders that come on the show with some of the listeners at home. So if there's one thing that you can ask for from the people listening, what would that be?
I would first check out what we're doing with Birchal, and I suppose get familiarize yourself with equity crowdfunding, whether you're a company or a brand, and if you're interested in joining our company, that's pretty much the one thing that I suppose I would like to open ourselves up for. Like, we're looking for really good talent to join our team, and actually can make a massive impact in equity crowdfunding, I suppose, over the medium term. So, yeah, get in touch if you're interested in looking at us as a potential as a job opportunity. And second to that, familiar yourself with equity crowdfunding and watch this space, because it's going to grow pretty phenomenally over the next few years. Yeah.
Fantastic. Any particular roles that you're currently sort of looking for, or are you just kind of looking to chat with interesting people?
Just interesting people, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, like, I generally don't look for any specific role. I'm looking at, I suppose, picking up talent. Like, it's very hard to know what roles to put people in, I suppose, at this early stage. So I'm just looking at general talent, yeah.
Fantastic. I'll make sure. Oh, also, what's the best way for someone to reach out to you or find out more about Birchal?
I'll just look me up on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yep.
Alan Crabbe. There are not too many of us. Yeah.
Perfect. I'll add that into the link for the show notes. Anyways, Alan, once again, thanks for coming on, and best of luck with Birchal. Really excited to see where you take it.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to episode 7 of the Startup Playbook Hustle. You can find the show notes of my interview with Alan, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest interviews. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at the next episode.